I saw this video from your boy Zach about gay characters in comic books, and I wanted to throw in my 2 cents. He was reacting to a video with Eric July and Ethan Van Sciver talking about the, and I'll be nice, tragic failure of Joe Glass in his comic book The Pride. For those who don't know, Joe Glass is a comic book journalist and creator. He's worked on his series The Pride for at least the last decade. While he's gotten some attention, particularly getting the book featured on Comixology, it wasn't a smash hit. Joe has complained for years about his comic book career, specifically that it never popped off the way many others' careers did, like Magdalene Fasaggio and Vita Ayala. For all his constant references to his sexuality, Joe got nothing. No major publisher work, no major character titles. Zach also pointed out that like Mags, Joe could be very twatty on Twitter, except he was, and still is, very in-your-face about it. In short, Joe should have gotten the purse puppy treatment, but he didn't, and hasn't stopped complaining since. Now he's at the point where he's working a day job and trying to make his comic book series, but the book just doesn't sell well, and he's mystified why. Take a wild guess what his book is about. Yes, that's exactly right. The Pride is about gay superheroes. Here's a synopsis from Amazon. Quote, Babman is sick of being seen as a joke. Tired of the LGBTQ+ community being seen as inferior to straight heroes, he thinks it's about damn time he did something about it. Bringing together some of the world's greatest LGBTQ+ superheroes, The Pride is born to protect the world and fight prejudice, misrepresentation, and injustice, not to mention a pesky supervillain or two. Why ever hasn't this gotten over with superhero fans? In both videos, Eric, Ethan, and Zach talk about why The Pride bombed, namely that it's too focused on gay characters. They make the point that most people are straight, so having a cast of mostly gay characters would be a turnoff. They come up with a theory about the right number of gay characters needed for a book to succeed. Eric and Ethan put it at about 3%, whereas Zach puts it at about 20%. But that misses the point. The problem isn't the number of gay characters. After all, Iceman bombed, and there was only one gay character in the book. No, the problem is that, like Iceman, The Pride is about gay superheroes, instead of superheroes who happen to be gay. Now, I know someone's going to quote the Carlin bit about happens to be black, but hear me out. When you read the synopsis for The Pride, what's the hook? Why are you being told to read this book? Well, it's because, quote, Babman is sick of being seen as a joke. Tired of the LGBTQ+ community being seen as inferior to straight heroes, he thinks it's about damn time he did something about it. So, Babman's reason for putting on a silly costume and using his powers isn't to save other people. It isn't to stop villains. It's to get validated. In short, it has nothing to do with the superhero genre. That's why it bombed. Joe Glass's point was to be seen, like he says in this article from the Pride website, unrelated to his book. Quote, let me start with how I came to make The Pride. I have read comics for most of my life, and I pretty much started with the X-Men. Even at a young age, the idea of a group of heroes who come together to protect themselves and others from a world that fears and hates them was an immediate draw, even if at first I couldn't articulate why. But as I got older, it became clear to me, as I slowly came to the realization and admitted to myself my own differences. I was gay. I wasn't like the majority of my friends. I felt differently. I thought differently. And whether explicitly or not, it was already implied to me that that difference was something to be ashamed of, to hide. Suddenly the draw of X-Men became clear to me, and grew, as it became about finding one's community, finding those like you, and being able to make a life for yourself too. But while mutants make a brilliant metaphor for being queer, I quickly noticed that that was all they were, a metaphor. No character, to me at the time, was visibly and openly queer. They were just coded that way, or their experiences could just be read as a good stand-in for the queer experience, but it was like they dare not put that into words. Yes, that's because that's how metaphors work. Mutants are a metaphor for outcasts, be it based on sexuality, sex, race, religion, or whatever. They're not tied to any specific group, so they weren't coded as queer. You just read them that way, the same way that Kwanzaa Sejefo, aka Fake Holiday, read them as black. Expecting Marvel to make the mutants one-for-one analogies for either group defeats the point of the metaphor, and it also looks like Joe missed the point as well. Like Kwanzaa, Joe Glass wasn't interested in the lives of the characters so much as he was interested in his life being reflected by them. Quote, years later I learned about Northstar and Karma, but those characters weren't very active in the comics I read at the time, either hidden or unused, or coming in for a quick spell, and sometimes so quickly you wouldn't even know about their different sexualities compared to the majority of other characters. Yeah, it's almost like they weren't defined by their sexuality, pretty much like every other character. Keep in mind, North Star and Karma are two third-rate characters who work great in ensembles but usually can't carry a book. They're just not that interesting or unique. North Star is basically discount Quicksilver. Now, that's not to say that no writers or editors hesitated to use the characters because they were gay, only that these weren't exactly fan-favorite characters, so it makes sense that they wouldn't be in tons of stories. But again, I don't think the usage of the characters was the issue for Joe. I think the issue for him is that he wanted to see himself in those characters, to be seen, not as a person, but as a gay man, and since that wasn't being done, he decided to do it himself, to make a comic book about gay superheroes. So, let's ask the obvious question. Why superheroes? He answers, quote, "Well, superheroes often have to live a dual life, one that is their true, honest self, floating in the clouds with a wry smile on their face and a witty retort on their lips, and then the other, duller, mundane lie, to protect the ones they love from the truth, or perhaps to protect themselves, because they don't want to risk losing those they love. What queer person hasn't had to live some semblance of this, whether the initial fears of coming out, or the daily temporary closets we have to fling up whenever we find ourselves in a new workplace, or a new locale, or even a taxicab where we don't know what the reaction to the truth would be? Living while queer is tantamount to being ready to throw on a costume and a mask at a moment's notice, sometimes for lifetimes." And what does that have to do with stopping a magnetic Jewish dude from ironically causing the second Holocaust? Or some woman suffering from postpartum depression rewriting the world on a whim? Or some intergalactic being trying to eat the planet? Or a bunch of the supposedly good guys fighting with each other over whether the government can force people to register themselves as living weapons? Not a damn thing. And that's why this book didn't get over. It's not about superheroes. By his own admission, Joe Glass says that the stories are just about validating gay people's feelings. That's why it failed. Not because the characters are gay. It wouldn't matter if every character or only one character were gay. You're writing genre fiction, but ignoring the genre to focus on the character's sexuality. If that's the case, it doesn't need to be a superhero comic. You can tell that story in a real-world setting. But the moment you set it in genre fiction, whatever story you tell has to function within the genre, even if it's just about people's feelings. A perfect example of this is the third episode of the Last of Us series. The show and the game are both about people's relationships, so inevitably the dramatic moments will hinge on what people are willing to do or not to do for those they love. The Bill and Frank episode breaks down what happens when a person who's cut himself off from society finally finds someone to love and how it changes him. Can you tell that story in a real-world setting? Yes, but it works better in a dystopia because now you can play out Bill's isolation to the extreme. You can have moments of Bill and Frank being attacked, having to meet total strangers, and dealing with death on a more visceral level. Everything that happens in this story is a function of their isolation due to the apocalypse. If you tried this in the real-world setting, Bill would just be crazy, and Frank would be even crazier to hook up with him. In The Last of Us, Bill's paranoia makes some sense. It's built into the genre. The same goes for Ellie and Riley, Joel and Tess, Joel and Ellie, and even Sam and Henry. Their drama is built into the world of The Last of Us. Take them out of that setting, out of the genre of the zombie apocalypse, and all these people come across as psychos. Another great example is V for Vendetta and Valerie's letter to Evie. Valerie's story could happen for real, especially in the Middle East or a southern state, but it functions best in the fictional dystopia of V's world. Now you can play up the homophobia to extremes, to use the genre setting as a tool to show the horror of what Valerie experiences and what Evie can expect to be done to her. If you threw in a lesbian story that had nothing to do with the dystopia just because you wanted to validate lesbians, it would make no sense. And that brings us back to Joe's The Pride. The book, according to him, is about being gay or trans or queer or however you want to put it. It's about playing on tropes from a certain segment of the queer community. That's not going to appeal to most gay or trans people, let alone most superhero fans. That's an incredibly niche concept that appeals to an even smaller audience. But what if Joe Glass inverted the stories and focused on characters being superheroes and their sexuality was just part of their character development? You know, like what's normally done in superhero stories. Well, for one, it would probably work. Once you start focusing on who the character is and their goals for being heroes instead of who they're interested in, there's more to work with. 2, it'd make it much easier for you to win over straight readers. Again, The Last of Us is a perfect example of this. That Bill and Frank episode was one of the best written, directed, and acted episodes of the show. and it received massive praise for its portrayal of Bill and Frank's relationship. Were there people who hated the episode because it was too gay? Yes, but there will always be people like that, most of them coming from a particular political and religious background. And I got a newsflash for you. You'll never win them over. They're always going to react like that. But what you can do is tell a good story set in the genre that you're writing. Get the readers emotionally invested in the characters as people instead of avatars for certain groups. And you'll find that if you do just a good job, most people, including straight people, will go along for the ride. If you do a great job, you'll get that Bill and Frank reaction, where people have this deep connection to their loving but tragic story. And keep in mind, that's your job. You're supposed to get the audience to connect to the characters as people, not token representations or self-inserts. You only get that emotional connection when you present your character as a person, never as a member of a group. And I got more news for you. When you do that, all those gay people you're trying to appeal to will connect with that character because they see them as a real, living, breathing person with thoughts and feelings and goals. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go watch Star Trek, any series. The original, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, the third season of Picard, the only Trek shows that exist. None of those characters were defined by their race, sex, or sexuality. They were people, and that's why the audience loved them. When you bring that to your comic and make the pride about superheroes and how being a hero affects their lives, the whole cast could be gayer than a bag of Skittles, and you will still get the broader audience you want. But if you keep making it about queer representation, no one will buy your book, not even the gay and trans people who want to see themselves in comics. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.